watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
And welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Wednesday evening, returning for a second show for the day. We had a show earlier with Bishop Strickland. Go and check it out if you haven't seen it already. We were talking about the crisis of abortion. Now we're going to be talking about a little bit of a different crisis, that is vaccines and vaccine ethics. And joining me here, we have Louis Dizon, frequent contributor, and then a new guest, Erin Kinsella. How are you, Erin? And welcome to the show.
I'm well. I can see the glare in my glasses, but I'm good.
Did I pronounce the name correctly?
Yes, Kinsella, straight up, exactly as it looks.
Well, before we dive into the topic itself, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your profession. I presume you're Catholic, but I might be wrong there. So tell us a little bit about your bio and how you got interested in this topic.
Yeah, so I started out when I was in university, high school. I wanted to do everything science, and then I got to university, and I really loved biology and chemistry in high school. So I was like, biochemistry, this is going to be great, and I hated it. And I was like, this is the worst. I don't want to memorize the Krebs cycle. This is all crap. It's stupid. But then I got to take this course in microbiology, and they got us to take this petri dish and to bring it somewhere to our house, like sprinkle some water on something. So I took my toothbrush and I sprinkled some like toothbrush water on it, anyways, to see what it grew. And so it grew these disgusting things that everybody has in their own mouth, but but that was like kind of the beginning of my love affair with all things.
Did you take a picture of it, by the way?
I did not. That was pre-cell phone.
Okay.
Because I am indeed old. So yeah, that was like, but I do remember throwing out my toothbrush every month until I got tired of that after a while. So yeah. So, but I'm in Canada. I'm in Ottawa, and I actually know Louis because I used to work at the Newman Center at the University of Toronto. I did the whole kind of undergrad thing. I did some grad work in Texas in virology, so specifically studying Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus, which is kind of similar to Ebola. So it makes you bleed and bleed out of all your orifices and die. So super fun. Yeah. Wow. Which is great. And then I actually so when I was in university, high school and university, I kind of was living a little bit of that double life for a while of I'm Catholic and I believe in God, but I didn't really have a relationship with God that was very personal. So in university, everything fell apart during my grad school. I ended up coming back to Ontario where my parents were at the time. And I had this kind of reversion or conversion to the faith. And from there, I actually started working in ministry and discerned my vocation. And so I'm now a consecrated virgin of the Archdiocese of Toronto, which is, I love the Archdiocese of Toronto. I'm a big fan. So that's great. And then I did recently in the last few years, a Master's of Theological Studies at St. Augustine's Seminary, which is also a really props for St. Augustine's because it is a great school with amazing, very faithful and very beautiful professors, all of them. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, awesome. Very, very good. So it definitely sounds like you have some qualification here to speak about vaccine ethics. So maybe just introduce us to the topic itself and tell us your thoughts about vaccines.
So this is a great topic. I think even to start off with, I would like to qualify things and say that I do not have a doctorate in biology or virology, anything like that. And I do not have a doctorate in theology. So definitely I have enough experience in both to kind of be able to wade through some of the information. So when we're talking about vaccines, one of the things that I find is most difficult is looking at the information, the plethora of information that's out there, right? And how do you actually sort through it? So this is the thing that I've been finding, this kind of weird set of skills and things that I don't know, come together in my life, that it's been really helpful to be able to sort through both the biological considerations, to be able to read the literature, understand what's happening, and then also to be able to read the things coming, out of the CDF and look at cooperation and all of those kind of things. So I guess to start out with, a good thing to consider is information, how we process information, how we determine its legitimacy or its accuracy. And I've used kind of an example to illustrate sometimes what I'm meaning when I'm talking about how we authentically evaluate information. And it would be like, which I think is kind of right up the alley of your show here. Also, I've been listening to episodes to like prep for the show. I'm like, yes. Like I'll be driving around in my car. I'm like, yes. Like,
These are all the episodes that have me on them, right?
that's right.
I'm just curious, which shows did you see?
So there were a couple with Taylor Marshall that
Yeah.
I was like, because those ones I was like, yeah. And then even the ones about, like, I think it's the pushback against, like, okay, so for me, I will say I am a daughter of the church. I believe and profess everything that the Catholic Church believes and professes I believe that everything is true, beautiful. But at the same time, I've also been frustrated on a number of occasions where it seems like there's an inconsistency at times with our ability to receive from the church what is coming through authentic authority in the church, just simply because it doesn't sit well with us, or because it's uncomfortable, or even if we have legitimate disagreement, like how we express it, how we choose to assent to things or not assent to things. So that was like the part where I was like, yes, I'm on board. That's good. That's good. Okay.
Awesome.
So coming back to that, I think the example that I've used a lot of times is if you have two Catholics and both of them are going into a room full of Protestants. So let's say it's whatever, Bible study or even just a Protestant service. If you have one Catholic who's very poorly catechized, does not know, their scripture, the teachings of the church well, and why we believe those things. And if they're kind of in a conversation with a bunch of people who are Protestant and who really know scripture well and are speaking in a very convincing way, it would be very difficult and disorienting for that person to be able to wade through the information that the group of people that they're in are kind of putting forward, right? And so how would they go about doing that? Well, probably it would be a lot of gut reaction or feeling or emotion or things like that. And it would be very difficult, I would think, to be in a situation like that. I mean, for me, even when I was first learning more about the faith, like having those conversations sometimes was like a deer in headlights. I don't know what is right or not right, but then it would be a totally different experience if somebody is a Catholic who is well catechized, who's well formed in their faith, whose conscience is well formed, having the same conversations with the same people. There would be a much more precise ability to discern between accurate and inaccurate, or what is true and what is not true. Really, that's what we're talking about if we're talking about faith. So I think that we can apply directly to our understanding of vaccines, because there is so much information when you go out there and, with social media, but also even, websites with, you're talking about like America's Frontline Doctors, and you're talking about these people who profess things. For example, the person who invented mRNA technology and who has spoken out against vaccines, but who actually invented a precursor to what's used in vaccines and has not worked extensively in vaccine research. Or even I've seen videos of people, for example, saying that they are a doctor. And what they mean is they're actually a PhD in, I forget the name of the guy, but he's a PhD and he has a PhD in like English literature or something like that. But he called himself a doctor and went into a thing and talked about getting the jab and all of these kind of things. And it's totally inaccurate, And I guess also just a background too, if people are wondering how we can look at how we can look at sorting through information. I think there's two things for me that have been helpful, both for me personally, but also I've been doing a lot of talking with people who are like hesitant or against vaccines, just to see like what the concerns are and if there's anything that I can contribute there. And so one of the things is looking at sources of information. So there's two sites that I can recommend to people right now. So one called PubMed. If you haven't heard of that, it's a central repository for peer-reviewed scientific research. So how it works in the scientific world, just in case you're really not familiar, is I'll give you like a real life example. So I was in the lab, working in a lab. We were sequencing the L segment, which is the longest segment of the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus. And so we do all the experiments, we do all of these kind of things. We write up a paper. And then that paper has to go through to be submitted to a journal. And then that journal will send out that paper to a number of experts in that same area. And those experts will read through the paper, see if there's anything stupid or totally like implausible, you know? And then once that process has taken place, often the paper will get sent back to whoever submitted it for revisions or things like that, similar to, you know, a doctoral dissertation, something like that. Or if there are any major problems, then the paper might be rejected for publication. And if it is accepted for publication with or without revisions, then it gets published. And so that's how kind of publishing works in the scientific world. And there are, so this website, PubMed, is a central repository for everything. So I've often suggested for people to go to PubMed, like Google it, go to PubMed. And then there's also another one that is kind of a pre-release research website. It's MedRxiv. So in case people would like to go there and check, you can also see. And that one is for articles that are in kind of the pre-peer-reviewed area. So it's for the very, very new things because of the time that it takes to go through review. Sometimes people are able to post their research now, their research findings on that, so that people can access them as quickly as possible and potentially use them for other research, right? So those are the two that I suggested. So that's like, those are good resources for people to be able to check out. And the other thing that I usually suggest along with that is if people go to PubMed and they're reading papers, or they're going to this other website and reading papers, and they can't understand what's in a paper, then my suggestion is humility. That's like, I mean, and I don't say that to be glib or to suggest that, like, I don't know, people are idiots if you can, but like, if I were to go to some kind of economic forum and try and read papers on an economic forum, I would be like, my brain would shut down. It would totally shut down. And it wouldn't be any use for me to be able to try and then make policy on economics, for example, because it's not my specialty. So then how do I decide who gets to make policy on economics? Well, there's a certain element of trust that I have to place in the hands of those people who are qualified to make those decisions. And so I think there is some of that in the sense of COVID and of vaccines, of being able to place a certain amount of trust in the people who are qualified to read and collate the information and make decisions based on that, right? And that does require a good deal of humility. So those are some of my initial thoughts, but I'm going to let you guys do the chat because I cannot talk and read at the same time. Otherwise I'll just start saying what I'm reading. But
well, we'll get to the chat here in a little bit. Lewis, go ahead and jump in here.
You don't have to worry about the chat box for now. We'll do Q&A at the end, and then if there are people like interesting questions, we'll highlight them for you to respond. But this is an ongoing discussion that I've had with a lot of people, and within Catholic circles, I find that the opinions tend to be all over the place. Some are okay with the COVID vaccine. Some are hesitant about it. Others, are just downright against it. And I've had a couple of rad trads actually go so far as to say that no Orthodox faithful Catholic would ever take the vaccine. So they've gone so far as to make that like a standard of orthodoxy. And there's a bunch of issues that are jumbled up with there, but they tend to be correlated. One is whether the vaccine is ethical on account of like cooperation with evil, and stuff like that. The second
I'm
issue,
excited to talk about that.
Yeah.
I'm excited to talk about that.
Yes. Yeah, so that's just one of the issues. The other one is, whether the vaccines are even safe to take. Like some people think that the risk of vaccine injury is a reason not to take it. Some people think that natural immunity is better than taking the vaccine. Some people will think that it's some form of experimental gene therapy. I could go on. And then the third issue that tends to come up is the question of mandates or vaccine passports. And of course, we live in the beautiful province of Ontario, which has implemented a vaccine passport just last month. So this is technically a separate issue because it's possible to believe that the vaccines are ethical, safe, and effective, and still believe that it should not be mandated on people. So we'll try to like cover all three of those things.
Sweet.
Yeah. So maybe we could talk about the first one, which is like the actual ethical part, specifically to do with cooperation with evil. Now, I know that the Vatican released a document on this. The Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith released an article called Note on the Morality of Using Some Anti-COVID-19 Vaccines. And for most people, for most Catholics at least, that's the fact that the CDF has weighed in on the issue is enough to settle the matter. But I know that there are some Catholics who think that, well, the CDF may not be entirely correct here. They think that that taking the vaccine is still not justified, and that the cooperation of evil is still not remote enough that you can conscientiously take the vaccine. But perhaps you could say a little bit more about that. Like maybe you can explain how this idea of cooperation with evil works, especially with regards to the vaccine.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. So if we're talking about cooperation, it's one of those things that's actually recognized by theologians widely as one of the most difficult kind of concepts to work with, because there are so many shifting factors, and because there is so many, like there is a certain element of perception of that, the kind of response of a well-formed conscience to what is right. So there is a certain element of that, so which can be tricky, because what is a well-formed conscience, right? Like, how do you know your conscience is well-formed? But we can come back to that. So cooperation essentially looks at the fallen world that we live in. So there is, sin, there are evil acts all around. And so as we live our daily lives, we are going to come in contact with those things. And it looks at what degree of responsibility we have for acting with an action that is evil. So if I give some examples of that, there's two kind of main kinds of cooperation. So one is formal and the other is material. And formal cooperation would be where you look at an act that is intended, that intends evil. So it would be like a nurse who wants to work at a Planned Parenthood and help with abortions. She is intending to work in she is intending by her actions to support the evil action of abortion, right? So that would be an example of formal cooperation. So material cooperation is where the evil is not intended. And so this is what we would be talking about in the majority of cases, especially for, Catholics, or when we're kind of weighing how how we need to approach situations. So an example of this might be a librarian who is checking out books, and there's somebody who's checking out a bunch of books about a topic that would be fundamentally at odds with Catholic beliefs, such as contraception, right? So in a sense, their actions are contributing potentially to this person's study or this person's, what is the word? Like interest in or involvement in contraception, right? So that would be kind of an example of material cooperation. But there are some things that we can look at in material cooperation, like when we act in actually another good example of that would be Movember. So anybody doing Movember? You guys both already have mustaches, so that's fun.
You can always start over.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Shave it and start over. Yeah. But let's say, for example, a Knights of Columbus is doing a Movember and they're going to donate money to the United Way, who gives money to abortion, right? That's an example of cooperation. So is it morally licit for that Knights of Columbus to do that fundraiser where the money is going to an organization and some of that money is going to go towards abortion? So how do we discern these things as we move through our life if we're looking at material cooperation? And so we're looking at some varying kind of tests is not the right word, but some considerations that we can look at when we're weighing how close our action is to supporting an evil action. So one of those things is the moral gravity of the act. So we can all say for sure with vaccines that the moral gravity of, I should say also, the issue with cooperation has to do with the way vaccines are produced and the way that they're tested, right? So there are some fetal cell lines that were derived from abortion. So there are different fetal cell lines. The most kind of talked about one is HEK293, and those are human embryonic kidney cells that were derived from an aborted fetus. Or there's some talk that it may have been a miscarriage, and then the mother consented for those cells to be used. Either way, the church would say, like, we understand that because of the dignity of the human person and because that person is a person from conception, that it is immoral to use fetal cells for research or for any purpose. And so those cell lines can be used in a number of different ways when you're developing vaccines. So one way could be in research. So the vaccines, when we're talking about embryonic stem cells, the reason that they're used at times is because they have the possibility to become various kinds of tissue. So they can be very useful in seeing how different body tissues will react to different drugs that will be used, or how they might take up the vaccine. Or because generally, if you're using a vaccine, it will be an actual virus particle that will be taken up to cells. So they can be used for looking at cellular expression and how that works and how effective they are with the uptake of the vaccine into cells, things like that. And so the two ways that generally that happens, one is with the preliminary research that is what is the case for the mRNA vaccines. So both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines used HEK293 cells in the preliminary research. The other thing that can happen is if you have vaccines that are live vaccines or inactivated or attenuated vaccines. So the difference between those is for a live vaccine, we really don't have a lot of those, but it's where the actual virus particle is given to cells and then is given to you, and then you can get an immune response from that. And then we have attenuated, where it means that the actual particles that you receive in your cell are not capable of replication. So they'll go into your cell, the proteins will be there, your immune system will recognize them, will generate an immune response, but the virus actually cannot spread. You can't get sick from it because it's unable to replicate. And then inactivated is like killed virus that you would receive, and it goes into your cells, and then your immune system responds that way. So so that's kind of how vaccines work in general. And the other way that the HEC293 cells can be used is in the production of these vaccines. So, for example, the rubella vaccine or the chickenpox vaccine would be produced using human embryonic cells. And those are the kind of the two ways that we look at those things. So the question of cooperation then, from moral theology, you have to kind of look at it from the starting point of the three ways that you identify things. So for something to be a moral act, to be morally licit, you have to identify the object and the intention and the circumstance. So those three things have to all be morally acceptable, morally good, to be able to call the act morally good, right? So in the case of vaccines, you can't just say, can I receive a vaccine? You have to be more specific in identifying, like, what is the question that we are actually saying, like, am I participating with evil or am I not participating with evil? So to use like an example for that, it would be if you see somebody walking down the street and there's a $5 bill that comes up, like falls out of their pocket and they don't see it. And then there's another person and there's a $5 bill that drops out of their pocket. And you do see it. Like, sorry, the one would be it drops out. You don't see the person. You just see the $5 bill. The other one would be it drops out of the person's pocket and you do see it drop out of the pocket, but the person doesn't notice it drops out of their pocket, right? So you can't just say that the object of what makes the act right or wrong that you want to look at, you can't just say picking up a $5 bill and saying whether that is right or wrong to pick up a $5 bill, because it doesn't tell you anything about your intention. It doesn't tell you anything about the circumstances around it. So you would have to say something like, is it right to pick up a $5 bill when you see it fall out of a person's pocket and they don't see it, right? So you have to be very specific. So when we're looking at vaccines, then the moral object that we're looking at, where we can kind of apply these principles of cooperation, would be something like, is it morally permissible to receive a vaccine that was produced using human embryonic kidney 293 cells? So that would be it. That would be it for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for the AstraZeneca vaccine, because those do use cells from aborted fetuses in production. And then it would be a different moral object for the mRNA vaccines, because they are not produced using aborted fetal cells. They were only did that in the actual production of it. So we would have to look at those two different things. But some other things that you have to look at in terms of cooperation are, what is the closeness? So we already looked at what is the matter that we're speaking of, and it would be grave matter in this case, because the question is referring to whether it is morally licit to use vaccines that were derived, either produced through aborted cells, or that involved aborted cells in their early testing. Is that grave matter? Yes, of course, because abortion is always and in every circumstance wrong, without question. So that's a yes. And then the second part that you would look at would be, what is the closeness of your action to the actual evil? So the evil in this case would be the aborted fetal cells, using aborted fetal cells. And for those who aren't sure about what actually happens with cell lines, it's not that there are continued abortions that are being used, continued cells from abortions that are being used when there is the production of vaccines or the testing of vaccines. It's a cell line from one aborted, not that this makes a difference, right? Because one person is one person. But I think some people are confused and think that it's more abortions that are happening so that we can study and produce vaccines, right? So it was one abortion, and those cells are propagated over time. So they're grown, in media in a lab over time, and they continue to be propagated from that one abortion, as opposed to numerous abortions. So that looks at this issue of closeness, the actual act would be the killing of that person by the taking of those cells in the blastocyst stage, which is at 4 or 5 days of development, and creating a cell line from those things. That is the evil action, right? And the evil action also would be using those cells to produce a vaccine. So those would be evil actions that are involved with the use of those cells. And part of looking at closeness is to look at degree of dependence. So, for example, if I go back to this example of the person who works in the library and they're checking out books looking at contraception, is their checking out of the books going to, if they refuse to do that, is it likely or is it possible that that would prevent the person from checking out the books? No. So there's not really a degree of dependence on the action of the person who's checking out the books, because that person will be checking out the books anyways, right? If you look at the degree of distance in terms of time and in terms of the actual action of destroying that embryo in order to use the cells, there's an element of time. It's now been, I think it was 1970 and 1964 that there were 2 cell lines that were created using aborted human cells. And so there have been many years, many generations of cells, which increases the remoteness of the actual act that is the evil that we're looking at, right? So there is a distance in time and space as well. And then you also look at what are the reasons for the act that you are doing. Is there a good of the act that you are doing? So you're looking at the actual evil of the act, the gravity of it, the closeness of it, and then you turn towards your action. So the action here would be, if I'm receiving a vaccination that was tested on aborted human fetal cells. So I received the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. So that would be my question, right? What is the necessity of a good that's coming from that? Well, the necessity of a good that's coming from that would be the protection of those who are extremely vulnerable to COVID. And I did see one element in the comments that talked about the fatality rate of COVID as being less than 1% for those who are 65 and under, which, first of all, that stat is not exactly correct. But even if it was correct, my action in taking a vaccine would be to protect those who are vulnerable, because there are so many who are vulnerable, who have underlying medical conditions, who are immunocompromised, and there is a good to be brought about in that by me taking a vaccine that will help protect those who are vulnerable. In addition to that, there is a good to be sought in bringing about the common good. So if we're looking at vaccines and how vaccines are used, this is one of the things that does happen when there are high rates of vaccine uptake, is that you'll see infection rates get lower. And when infection rates get lower, then deaths will go down generally. And then you will also be able to have an increase in kind of a normalcy of what we're doing in terms of day-to-day activity, right? So there is a good in that, to be able to support business, to be able to support. And I know, so friends in the States, it's much different in Canada than in the States, I think. So Michael, how much have you guys been locked down? Did you do lockdowns?
Yeah.
Some
still have lockdowns, really, but I mean,
mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how many people really respect them.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, Ontario, we've had a lot of lockdowns, and if there's anybody in Australia, for example, there's huge, I mean, they are darn serious about their lockdowns there, with police outside, and they're stopping people. And that's a whole other question about the morality of lockdowns and how effective they are and things like that. But coming back to cooperation, that really is essentially the question. So how is it that me taking a vaccine, am I contributing to that evil action of aborted fetal cells. There is some connection, but this is what the church says. So this is what the CDF has said in this note. This is what has been given in, there's some other instructions. So there's an instruction called Dignitas Personae on certain bioethical questions. So that looks at using fetal cells in research as well as vaccines. There's also one called Moral Reflections on Vaccines Prepared from Cells Derived from Aborted Human Fetuses. And that was given on June 9th, 2005. So this question has definitely been, like, it has been something that the church has commented on. The teaching office of the church has said that, yes, it is morally illicit to receive a vaccine for a serious illness because there is a great good to be derived in protecting life. So that would be the great good to be derived. And because of the remoteness from the evil act, and because there's also the question, kind of the last question that comes into cooperation is the question of witness and scandal. So, for example, one of the examples that we talked about in class when we were doing bioethics was a pride parade and what it means to, like, if it's okay to march in a pride parade, right? And so it would cause scandal in a sense if you have somebody Catholic who is marching in a pride parade, because it could be reasonably intuited from their actions that they support the elements that go into pride, which some are good in terms of the dignity of the human person, but many are not. Many are contrary to Catholic faith and belief, right? So in the same way, if we're looking at vaccines, there is a necessity of Catholics to oppose the use of aborted human fetal cells in anything, whether it is vaccines or research or anything. And there are lots of different ways that we can do that. But there also is a particular witness that is possible for the Christian who receives a vaccine and shows by their witness that they are having a consistent ethic in terms of their respect for life, which is important as well. So that's kind of cooperation in a nutshell. I also want to ask people's forgiveness in one sense, because I have, Lewis knows this, I used to work at the Newman Center, but I actually have fibromyalgia. So if there's any other of my like chronic illness compatriots out there, sometimes it's like the connection from my brain, it's like there, and then coming out of my mouth is like slower. So if there's anything that I say that doesn't that sits really weird, or you're like, you have no idea what I'm saying, then please ask, and I'm happy to clarify.
Yeah.
Now you've done really well so far.
Yeah, I think everyone understood what you were saying. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about the issue of vaccine safety, because I think that even if somebody is at the point where they think, well, maybe it's not a sin to take the vaccine, but I still don't trust it. I think that's a lot of Catholics, and even non-Catholics who are vaccine hesitant. You hear all of the things about how how do we trust the people who are making these? What if they're lying to us? What if the stats are all made up? And these vaccines, they haven't been around that long, so we don't know what their long-term effects are yet. And of course, there's always that lingering issue of vaccine injuries. We always have those odd cases where someone takes the vaccine and they end up with some sort of debilitating effect because of it. So perhaps you can speak to those issues.
Yes, I love this, by the way. It's such a complex thing, but I love the opportunity to also break it down because I'm an extrovert. So half the time I'm like, I only understand it fully when it comes out of my mouth, and I understand it a bit more. Yeah. So I think in terms of looking at vaccine safety, and in terms of adverse effects, this is absolutely an important thing to look at. And I think it's really disingenuous when people say that there is no risk to taking it. I think that's dumb. And I think people can kind of realize right away that is absolutely untrue, because there can be side effects from vaccines. So, for example, the AstraZeneca, you can see that there's a greater increased risk of blood clots. For the mRNA vaccines, in young men, there were some reports of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. And so these are real things. Even for kind of some reports of like nosebleeds, or for women, there can be fertility cycle disruptions, things like that. So those have been reported as well. So a few things I think are kind of important in that. So one is realizing a little bit of how we think about things. So in terms of our ability to process information, there have been so many studies that look at the emotional response that we have versus the response of objective information. And there is absolutely a phenomenon of trusting emotive responses more than objective information in some things. So if we hear about these adverse responses, for example, then there is a part of us rightly that responds to that and rejects that and says that is bad, and that is absolutely correct. That is bad. Adverse responses are obviously not to be desired, right? But there's also the reality that the numbers, so the actual research that's been put out there, even if people are saying that it's, premature and rushed and all of these kind of things, I'll talk about that in a minute. But the research that is out there looks at all of these reactions, and the number of reactions that people are having to vaccines is significantly less risky than actually contracting COVID for most of the population, even if you are younger. And even from those risks, like from the minuscule amount of risk for things, the adverse events that come out are things that have now been readily identified in medical settings. So if somebody received a vaccine, for example, if they received AstraZeneca and then they presented an ER with these symptoms, then they do have protocols to immediately respond to those things in a way that is effective most of the time. So there have not been, contrary to popular belief, there have not been a huge amount of deaths related to COVID vaccination at all. One thing that I can clarify too for that is some people will cite VAERS, which is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System in the US. And there's a similar one in Canada. And people, when they report an adverse event, it's absolutely possible. Like they want people to report adverse events because they do want to find, in particular, what's useful about those systems is a way to spot very rare adverse events. So like you say, Lewis, it hasn't been that long that the vaccines have been out. By and large, for all the vaccines that we have, if there are going to be any long-term side effects, they show up within 6 months or less of the vaccine. And that's especially true because the actual antigens, so for example, the mRNA, I hate Spikevax is such a stupid name. I was like so disappointed. I'm like, Moderna was my second one. It's now named Spikevax. That sounds like I don't know, like a kid's toy or something. But with that one, the actual antigen that they inject into your body that elicits your immune response is only present in your body for like a maximum of 14 days before your body clears it, because that is what your body is designed to do, is to clear foreign objects, right? And so then you won't have, like, we won't see, I will bet that I would bet, I mean, I don't have very much money, but I would bet it all that we're not going to see long-term effects like way in the future, And so VAERS, when you're looking at the reporting that people do, the same, similar for Canada and Europe, basically kind of almost every country has this kind of system, is people will go in and they will self-report. So they will self-report whatever symptom they think is caused by their vaccination. So the reports that people can access publicly, so if you go onto VAERS right now, the reports that you will see are not actually ones that have been verified. They're not actually ones that have been investigated in some way. And the purpose of actually having that database is mostly to be able to extract information from it. So they'll use, algorithms, and people who actually study epidemiology are able to take all of those reports, decipher the information, and see what is a likely actual side effect of the vaccine, what needs to be actually investigated, and what is an extraneous report. And so if you are an epidemiologist, you would have that ability to go through all of that information. It's also in Canada. I'm not sure what the deal is in the States, but in Canada, there actually also is a program for vaccine injury. So if somebody were to have a long-term injury from the COVID vaccine, there is actually financial support in Canada for that, which is good to know. And then in terms of safety, the overall risks of let me back up just a little bit and say that when we're talking about vaccination, we're very much talking about an issue of the common good. So we can talk about moral theology, absolutely, and this is something that we need to talk about for sure. But we also need to talk about Catholic social teaching and look at the common good and what that actually means with respect to vaccines. So if I'm looking at a vaccine, I personally did not get vaccinated to protect myself because I'm younger. I have not really any, medical things that would make me very high risk for COVID, but I live with somebody who has some things that could make them high risk for COVID. So when I get vaccinated, it's not for me, it's to protect other people. And this is the same reason why I would get the influenza vaccine every year, for example, is because I might be carrying it, not know that I have it, be pre-symptomatic, and then I shake, Granny's hand in church on Sunday during the sign of peace, and then I've infected somebody who could be very susceptible to that illness, when actually there would have been an easy way for me to protect that person, right? There's always risk either way. So if we're talking about the actual risks of vaccines and of COVID, there is a risk if you receive the vaccine that you may have some kind of side effect. The risk is very, very low, infinitesimally low, that you will have a major side effect with the vaccine. And if you don't get the vaccine, then there is risk, but it's not generally assumed by you, because if you're not somebody who is likely to get sick from it, then it's very true. You might even get infected and be asymptomatic. But then the risk becomes that you are passing that on to someone else, that you would be passing on COVID to somebody else who is particularly at risk for that disease. So when we're looking at the common good, and we look at that in terms of viruses or contagious diseases, we've already had things that have been legislated before. And that also is part of Catholic social teachings, the legitimacy of governments to make rules that will uphold the common good of citizens, right? So we can see that in tuberculosis. You have to have a TB test, you have to have a vaccine before you go into work in a healthcare setting or in a school or many other places. And it is legitimate for those things that are necessary to uphold the common good. So for me, when I was looking at, okay, will I get this vaccine? The choice was clear for me, because I would rather assume the small risk and be contributing towards something that's going to be protective of many people who would be much higher risk than myself than not. And I don't say that to be like, I don't know, be on like a moral high horse or whatever, but that was for me, that was the consideration,
Yeah. Now we have just a few more minutes left. I mean, I want to get to some Q&A because we have a show here, another one coming up in 10 minutes. I want to get to at least 2 to 3 questions. This one is from River Run. Thank you for the super chat. He says, or he asks, if vaccines apparently don't per se prevent transmission, how am I helping others by taking it?
Great question. So there's a few issues. One is looking at the burden on the healthcare system. And this has been a huge thing. So for example, in Alberta and Canada right now, there are lower rates of vaccination there. There are higher rates of transmission and infection. And their healthcare system right now has been overrun. So all of their ICU beds are full. And the effects of that are that you have less access of those who need it to life-saving measures in the healthcare setting. So my aunt, please pray for her. We found out that she has cancer, and it concerns me. Like, it is concerning if we were in kind of the height of pandemic peak in Ontario, for example, that her care may be compromised because healthcare workers are redeployed for areas that are being heavily hit. And then it could also be impactful in terms of making decisions about who lives and who dies, because there are a finite number of respirators, for example, and we could see that in Italy. I mean, I'm sure everybody kind of remembers Italy when the first wave hit, and there were so many infections there that they were having to make those kind of difficult decisions. Yeah.
This one is from Fundamentum Veritatis. How do we know with zero doubt no aborted fetuses are used after HEC 293? Is this solely based on trusting the company's statements on the matter?
Oh yeah, no. You can absolutely. I would highly encourage you to look at if you look at Patheos. There's a blog called Through Catholic Lenses, which is Father Matthew Schneider, and he's put some really excellent things out, and he has some descriptions of the various human fetal cell lines that are used in research, but also he looks at like even information about new ones that have been created, because there is kind of a shelf life of the cell lines that are made from aborted human fetuses, and there are more recent ones that have been made, for sure, that there's no doubt about that. Absolutely. But companies they do produce that in their publications. So anything where they're looking at production of vaccines, they do indicate which cell lines they were grown in, which they were tested in. That's all published information that you can find. Father Matthew has all the information on his blog, but also he has some really interesting things. Like if we're looking at cooperation, for example, that we cooperate every day. We are involved in mediate material cooperation in our lives every single day. So who has a cell phone? All of us, right? There are huge abuses, huge human rights abuses, and even death that occur for you to obtain some of the material used in cell phones. Companies looking at donating to Planned Parenthood. It's almost impossible to not be involved with companies or to kind of exist in daily life without some kind of immediate material cooperation. And even if you look at some of the drugs that are being pushed by people who might be vaccine hesitant or listening to some of the like America's Frontline Doctors, things like that, ivermectin, remdesivir, and hydroxychloroquine were all produced using testing on HEK 293 cells. So I mean, there's also immediate material cooperation there, even for those drugs that are kind of touted as possible treatments for COVID-19.
Nth Degree, thank you for your super chat. He asks, is the overall good served by introducing a leaky vaccine? Could that not encourage mutations?
Yeah, so it depends on what the uptake is from people, but what they're actually finding in the research. And I mean, to be honest, like, this is why it's sometimes difficult, is because things are evolving. Like, we are in a global pandemic. Most of us, unless you were around in 1918, have not been really involved in a global pandemic of this scale before. And so we're learning a lot all the time. And with vaccines, if we're talking about leakiness, right now the issue with the vaccines that are available on the market is that they are not meant to stem transmission. So they're not meant to be something that is going to stop you from being able to transmit the vaccine to others. But they were primarily intended to be able to lower mortality and to be able to prevent hospitalizations. And that's kind of their aim. So now there are vaccines that are being developed that are looking more at transmission, and so those will be more effective in terms of, being able to do something like, for example, in 1980, smallpox was eradicated in nature because of a vaccination campaign. And so that was possible because it was a vaccine that actually prevents transmission. And so something like that would be, it's not likely for a coronavirus because the nature of coronaviruses, they're very ubiquitous, that we would be able to eradicate COVID-19, but it's absolutely possible that vaccines produced in the future may be able to mitigate some of the transmission or mutation, but that's certainly a global effort and also has to do with the common good, because us in very wealthy countries, there has to be some kind of systematic plan to help those who are in countries that are not able to afford vaccinations in the way that we are. Otherwise the efforts are pretty futile.
Erin, I want to thank you so much for coming on. We have just one more to sneak in. Am I correct in my belief that there are no clinical trials for this vaccine on pregnant women? We got just a few more minutes if you want to take a stab at that for a minute or two.
Yeah, so there's one trial where there were 23 women who got pregnant during the trial, and there were no miscarriages or adverse effects, except for one woman who miscarried who actually received the placebo and not the actual vaccine. And so that's like obviously a crazy small sample size considering, but we have seen a lot of what's out there now is research that is being done in that. So there's not a lot of like peer-reviewed kind of rigorous research that's being kind of proactively done right now, but what's being done is tracking of pregnancy in women who are receiving the vaccine and looking at adverse outcomes for pregnancy. And so far, there have been no identified kind of increased risk from COVID vaccines, either during pregnancy, pre-pregnancy, or for women who are postnatal, like when the baby is very young. So far, it looks like there is not a lot of risk, but it's very true that there needs to be a little bit more research in that before we can really say something conclusive, like for sure from a peer-reviewed study.
Excellent. Again, Erin, I thank you so much. You helped clarify quite a few questions that I've had, and love to have you back on. And by the way, go ahead and put in a plug for anything that you want to direct the audience to.
Ooh, on a totally separate note, I'm part of a podcast called In the Thicket, which is all about suffering. So it's myself and a couple of friends, and we talk about, basically suffering, which sounds super depressing, but it's actually not, because we're funny and ridiculous. So Lewis can attest to it, right, Lewis?
Yeah. Absolutely.
We'd love to have you listen to that. It's at In the Thicket Podcast.
It's on YouTube or iTunes or
anywhere you get your podcasts, it's there, and it's also on YouTube as well, or inthethicketpodcast.com is our website. You can find us there as well. Thanks.
Perfect. Once again, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. You're welcome on the show anytime.
Thanks, Michael.
And Lewis, thanks for coming back on and doing this.
My pleasure.
Everybody, stay tuned. We have another show coming up here in just a moment with Kevin Simmons, who's going to be doing his last webinar here on Our Lady of Fatima. So check it out here in just a few minutes. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're almost at 15K. We're about 50 shy of it. So help us get there. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support us. Until next time, which will be in about 3 minutes. God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life